The night was quiet in the suburbs of Arlington. A few streetlights flickered as Andrew Taylor drove his black sedan through the empty streets. He checked his watch, almost midnight. His eyes were tired after the long flight back from overseas, but his mind stayed sharp. That's what years of CIA training did to a person. Andrew wasn't supposed to think about his real job. To his neighbors, he was just a hard-working IT consultant who traveled a lot. Nobody knew that he had just spent 3 weeks in Eastern Europe gathering information that would help keep the country safe. The secret life he led wasn't easy, but it was necessary. As he turned onto Maple Street, just 2 blocks from his apartment, he noticed headlights in his rearview mirror. A police cruiser had been following him for the last mile. Andrew did what he always did. He drove carefully, maintaining the exact speed limit, using his turn signals properly. He had nothing to worry about. His car was in perfect condition, his license was valid, and he hadn't broken any laws. Still, a feeling of unease grew in his stomach. He'd been here before, too many times. The red and blue lights suddenly flashed behind him. Andrew took a deep breath and pulled over smoothly. He reached for his wallet, then placed both hands on the steering wheel where they could be seen. These small actions had become second nature over the years. 2 officers approached, one on each side of the car. The taller one, whose badge read Officer Daniels, tapped on the window with his flashlight. "License and registration," he said, not bothering with a greeting. His voice was cold, his face showing no emotion. "Good evening, officer," Andrew replied calmly. "May I reach for my documents?" The officer nodded stiffly. As Andrew slowly reached for his glove compartment, he noticed the officer's hand drift toward his holster. The second officer, standing on the passenger side, was already resting his palm on his gun. "What seems to be the problem?" Andrew asked, handing over his license and registration. Officer Daniels looked at the documents, then at Andrew, his eyes narrowing. "Your left taillight is out." Andrew knew this wasn't true. He had checked all his car's functions just yesterday. "That's strange," he said. "I just had the car serviced last week." "Step out of the vehicle, sir," the second officer suddenly commanded. "May I ask why?" "Unhappy to." "I said step out of the vehicle. Now." Andrew recognized the shift in their behavior. The change had come the moment they'd seen his face, a black man driving an expensive car in this neighborhood. It didn't matter that he owned a home here. It didn't matter that he worked for the government. What mattered at this moment was only the color of his skin. Carefully, Andrew stepped out of the car. The night air felt cold against his face. "Where are you coming from at this hour?" Officer Daniels asked, his tone suggesting Andrew had no right to be out late. "I'm coming home from work," Andrew explained. "I'm an IT consultant, just got back from a business trip." The officers exchanged looks. "This your car?" The second officer asked, as if the registration Andrew had just handed them wasn't proof enough. "Yes, it is." "Seems like a pretty nice car for an IT guy," Officer Daniels remarked. "How long have you lived around here?" 5 years, Andrew answered, maintaining his composure despite the obvious implications behind their questions. "Mind if we take a look inside your vehicle? If you've got nothing to hide." Andrew knew his rights. "Actually, officer, I do mind. Unless you have probable cause or a warrant, I don't consent to a search." Something dangerous flashed in Officer Daniels' eyes. He stepped closer. "You know, we've had reports of drug activity in this area, and your nervous behavior gives us reasonable suspicion." Andrew wasn't nervous, he was careful. There's a difference that these officers either couldn't or wouldn't see. "I'm going to have to ask you to place your hands against the vehicle while we conduct a search," the officer continued. As Andrew stood there, watching the officers begin their illegal search of his car, he remained calm on the outside. Inside, his mind was working, noting every detail, every procedural violation. He didn't know yet how far these officers would go, but years of CIA training had taught him one important lesson: observe everything, remember everything. Knowledge was power, and eventually it would be his turn to use it. What the officers didn't realize as they dug through his possessions was that they hadn't just pulled over any black man. They had pulled over someone trained to notice details, someone who understood the law better than they did, someone whose true identity would eventually turn their world upside down. Officer Daniels circled Andrew's car like a shark, shining his flashlight into every corner. The second officer, whose name tag read Rodriguez, had already begun pulling items from the glove compartment, tossing registration papers and maintenance receipts onto the passenger seat. "Stand still," Daniels barked when Andra shifted his weight slightly. "Keep your hands where I can see them." Andra complied, his face a mask of calm despite the storm brewing inside him. The night air had grown colder, or maybe it was just the chill of injustice that made him shiver. He watched as Rodriguez emerged from the car with a triumphant look. Well, what do we have here?" Rodriguez held up a small plastic bag containing white powder. Andrew's heart sank. He knew with absolute certainty that the bag wasn't his. It hadn't been in his car moments ago. "That's not mine," Andrew said firmly, his voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. "That wasn't in my vehicle." Daniels laughed, a hollow sound that echoed through the empty street. "That's what they all say. You think we haven't heard that before?" "I'm telling you, that was planted. I want my lawyer present before any further questioning," Andrew stated, falling back on his rights. "Lawyers are for guilty people," Rodriguez said, stepping closer. "What are you hiding?" "I'm not hiding anything," Andrew replied, "but I know my rights." Within minutes, Andrew found himself being roughly handcuffed, the cold metal biting into his wrists. The officers didn't bother reading him his Miranda rights. Another violation Andrew silently noted. They pushed him into the back of their patrol car, his head nearly hitting the doorframe. Through the window, Andrew could see other officers arriving at the scene. They talked in hushed voices, occasionally glancing his way. One of them began searching his car more thoroughly, pulling out the seats and checking under the floor mats. Andrew knew they wouldn't find anything else because there was nothing to find. The bag of cocaine had appeared as if by magic, dirty cop magic. At the police station, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Andrew was led through a maze of hallways. Officers stared as he passed, some with curiosity, others with predetermined judgment in their eyes. The booking process was deliberately slow, each officer taking their time to process his fingerprints and photograph. "Look straight ahead," ordered the booking officer, snapping Andrew's mugshot. "Turn to the right, now the left." Andrew complied, his mind racing to his CIA handler. He was supposed to check in by morning. When he failed to do so, protocols would be activated, but how long would that take? Hours? Days? The operations he'd been part of were too sensitive to risk exposure, even to save himself from false charges. "Empty your pockets," a desk sergeant commanded. Andrew carefully placed his wallet, keys, and phone on the counter. The sergeant picked up the phone with interest. "Fancy phone for a drug dealer," he remarked. "I'm not a drug dealer," Andrew replied evenly. "I'm an IT consultant." The sergeant rolled his eyes. "Sure you are, and I'm the president." After booking, they led Andrew to an interrogation room, small, windowless, with a metal table bolted to the floor and 3 uncomfortable chairs. They left him there alone for nearly 2 hours, a common tactic to increase anxiety and break down resistance. But Andrew had been trained to withstand much worse conditions. He used the time to mentally review every detail of what had happened, preparing his statement. When Daniels and Rodriguez finally entered, they carried coffee cups for themselves but offered nothing to Andrew. Rodriguez slammed a folder onto the table dramatically. "We know who you are," he stated, though his confident tone suggested otherwise. "We've been watching you for weeks." Andrew knew this was a lie. Standard police bluffing. "I'd like to speak to my lawyer," Andrew repeated, his third request that evening. "Your lawyer can't help you," Daniels said, leaning forward. "We found 50 grams of cocaine in your vehicle. That's intent to distribute. You're looking at 10 years minimum." "That's not my cocaine," Andrew repeated. "It was planted in my car during your illegal search, which I never consented to." Rodriguez laughed. "Who do you think a judge will believe? 2 decorated officers or some drug dealer?" "I believe they'll believe the truth," Andrew said calmly. What the officers didn't realize was that Andrew wasn't just fighting for himself. As they continued their intimidation tactics, writing down statements he never made and ignoring his requests for legal representation, he was silently building a case that would eventually expose not just their corruption, but an entire system that had allowed them to operate with impunity for years. Outside the interrogation room, the The wheels of justice, through justice, were already beginning to turn. The night stretched on endlessly in the interrogation room. Andrew had been questioning himself about how much he should say. As a CIA operative, he had been trained for situations like this, but none of his training scenarios had involved corrupt cops in his own country. "Look," said Officer Daniels, returning to the room with a fresh cup of coffee that released steam into the cold air. "You're only making this harder on yourself. Just tell us who you work for, and maybe we can cut you a deal." Andrew looked directly into Daniels' eyes. "I've already told you. I work in IT Consulting." Rodriguez slammed his hand on the table. "Stop lying. Nobody in IT makes enough money to drive a car like that and live in that neighborhood." "I do well in my field," Andrew replied calmly. The truth was more complicated. Andrew's cover as an IT consultant was carefully crafted by the CIA. He did actual consulting work for legitimate companies between missions, building a solid paper trail of income that matched his lifestyle. His employers never realized they were part of an elaborate cover story. "We checked your story," Daniels said, lying through his teeth. "The company you claim to work for has never heard of you." Andrew knew this was impossible. His cover was airtight, backed by years of carefully planted records and references who would confirm his employment. This was just another interrogation tactic. "That's not true," Andrew stated firmly. "If you called them, they would confirm I've been working there for over 5 years." Rodriguez pushed a notepad toward him. "Write down the names of your contacts there. We'll check." Andrew wrote down the names of his cover contacts, knowing they would verify his story. What the officers didn't know was that by pushing this line of questioning, they were actually helping him establish his cover identity even more firmly in the record. Hours passed. The officers took turns questioning him, using every trick in the book. They played good cop, bad cop. They pretended to have witnesses. They claimed to have video evidence. Andrew remained steady, asking repeatedly for a lawyer and refusing to confess to a crime he didn't commit. At some point after 3 a.m., a new player entered the room. A man in a cheap suit with tired eyes introduced himself as Detective Walsh. "I'm taking over this interrogation," Walsh announced, dismissing the 2 officers with a wave of his hand. Once they left, he sat down across from Andrew. "Look, I'm going to be straight with you," Walsh said, his voice lower and less aggressive than the others. "Those 2 have a reputation in the department, not a good one. I've been looking into some of their arrests, and I'm seeing patterns that concern me." Andrew remained silent, studying the detective's face. Was this another trick? "I'm not saying I believe you're innocent," Walsh continued, "but I want to make sure we're doing this by the book. You've been asking for a lawyer for hours, and that request should have been honored immediately." He slid a phone across the table. "Make your call." Andrew picked up the phone cautiously and dialed a number from memory. It wasn't his regular lawyer, it was a secure line to his CIA handler. When someone answered, Andrew spoke in seemingly normal terms about needing legal help, but the coded phrases he used would alert his handler to exactly what kind of situation he was in. After he hung up, Walsh studied him with new interest. That was a strange conversation for someone calling their lawyer. Andrew shrugged. "He knows what I need." Walsh collected the phone and left Andrew alone again. Through the small window in the door, Andrew could see increased activity in the hallway. Officers were moving with more purpose, and there seemed to be some kind of disagreement happening at the desk sergeant's station. An hour later, a woman in a perfectly tailored suit walked in. She introduced herself as Attorney Chen. "I'll be representing you, Mr. Taylor," she said, her voice crisp and professional. "I need to speak to my client alone," she told the officer who had escorted her. Once they were alone, she lowered her voice. "Your handler sent me. Everything is in motion. The agency is aware of your situation, but we need to proceed carefully. National security operations could be compromised if we move too quickly or reveal too much." Andrew nodded, relief washing over him. "Those officers planted evidence in my car." "I know," Chen replied. "This isn't the first time they've done something like this, but it will be the last." She opened her briefcase and removed some papers. "We have a plan, but you'll need to be patient. Sometimes the wheels of justice turn slowly, but when they finally do, for the first time since being arrested, Andrew allowed himself a small smile. The officers who thought they had all the power didn't realize who they were really dealing with. Their day of reckoning was coming, and Andra would be there to witness it. Back at the police station, Officers Daniels and Rodriguez weren't worried. They had done this before, many times. They sat in the break room, drinking coffee and discussing their case against Andra as if his fate was already sealed. "This one will be easy," Daniels said, leaning back in his chair. "We've got the drugs, we've got the expensive car, and we've got a guy who can't explain where his money comes from." Rodriguez nodded. "The dash cam footage needs to be dealt with, though." "Already on it," Daniels replied. "Technical malfunction. Happens all the time." What they didn't know was that Detective Walsh was standing just outside the door, listening to every word. He had been watching these two for months, gathering evidence of their misconduct, but never had enough proof to move against them. Until now, perhaps. Across town, in a nondescript office building, a group of people gathered around a conference table. The oldest among them, a gray-haired man with sharp eyes that missed nothing, studied a file labeled classified. "How long has Agent Taylor been in custody?" he asked. 14 hours now, sir," replied a younger agent. "His attorney has made contact." "And the operation in Kiev?" "Secure. Agent Taylor completed his mission before returning. The intelligence is already being processed." The gray-haired man, Deputy Director Wilson, closed the file. "These officers have no idea what they've stepped into, but we need to be careful. We can't expose Agent Taylor's identity publicly without compromising national security." "What's the play then?" asked another agent. "We work within the system, but we pull every string we have," Wilson said. "Get me Judge Hammond on the phone and find out everything there is to know about Officers Daniels and Rodriguez." Back at the station, Andrew was moved to a holding cell. The concrete bench was hard and cold, but he had endured far worse during his training. He closed his eyes, not to sleep but to think. Attorney Chen had given him hope, but he knew from experience that hope alone wasn't enough. He needed to stay sharp. In another part of the building, Daniels and Rodriguez were meeting with the district attorney, a young ambitious man named Powell who didn't ask too many questions when the arrests helped his conviction record. "We've got him dead to rights," Daniels explained. "Found the drugs in his glove compartment during a routine traffic stop." Powell flipped through the paperwork. And why was he stopped? "Broken taillight," Rodriguez answered quickly. "And you have the dash cam footage showing this taillight." Daniels cleared his throat. "Unfortunately, there was a technical issue with the camera that night." Powell looked up, his expression hardening slightly. "That's becoming a pattern with your arrests, gentlemen." Before either officer could respond, his phone rang. Powell answered, listened for a moment, then his face paled. "Yes, sir, I understand. Right away." He hung up and looked at the officers with new wariness. "There's been a development. The FBI is taking an interest in this case." The FBI. Daniels couldn't hide his surprise. Why would they care about a simple drug bust? "They didn't say," Powell replied, gathering his papers quickly. "But they're sending agents over now." Across town, a man named Lee Thompson was being interviewed by police officers, not Daniels or Rodriguez, but officers from Internal Affairs. Thompson was a known informant who had worked with the corrupt officers before. "They told me what to say," Thompson admitted nervously. "They've been doing this for years. They target black men driving nice cars, plant evidence, then get me to testify that I bought drugs from them before." "And you're willing to stake this on the record?" asked the Internal Affairs officer. Thompson looked terrified. "They'll kill me." "We can protect you," the officer assured him. "But we need your testimony." Meanwhile, Andrew's attorney was meeting with the judge assigned to the case. Chen placed a sealed envelope on the judge's desk. "This contains information about my client that is classified at the highest levels," she explained. "I need you to review it in private, Your Honor." Judge Hammond, a stern woman with 30 years on the bench, took the envelope cautiously. "This better be as important as you are suggesting, Counselor." "It is, Your Honor, and when you see what's inside, you'll understand why this case needs special handling." As darkness fell again, the pieces were moving into place. Officer Daniels received a text message from another officer. "Something's wrong." FBI and Internal Affairs both asking questions about Taylor's arrest. For the first time, Daniels felt a flicker of uncertainty. What made this man so special? Why were the feds involved? He had no way of knowing that the net was already closing around him, that his years of corrupt policing were about to catch up with him in a way he never could have imagined. 3 days after his arrest, Andrew sat in a small conference room at the courthouse, dressed in the suit Attorney Chen had brought him. The fabric felt good against his skin after days in the scratchy jail uniform. His preliminary hearing was scheduled for the afternoon, and Chen was briefing him on what to expect. "The evidence against you looks strong on paper," she explained, arranging documents on the table between them. "But we've been working behind the scenes. Judge Hammond reviewed the classified information yesterday." Andrew nodded. "And?" "She was impressed," Chen said with the hint of a smile. "She's granted our request for a special closed-door session before the main hearing." A knock at the door interrupted them. Detective Walsh entered, looking uncomfortable in a tie that seemed to be choking him. "Sorry to interrupt," he said, "but I thought you should know. Internal Affairs has opened an official investigation into Daniels and Rodriguez. They've pulled their arrest records for the past 3 years and found some disturbing patterns." Chen raised an eyebrow, such as 27 arrests of black men in expensive cars, all for drug possession, all during traffic stops, all with malfunctioning dashcams, Walsh explained. "And 17 of those cases used the same informant to corroborate." "That's helpful," Chen said, making notes. "Will you testify to this?" Walsh looked torn. "I've been on the force 15 years. Never thought I'd be testifying against fellow officers." "But," Andrew prompted. "But what they're doing isn't policing. It's criminal," Walsh said firmly. "So yes, I'll testify." After Walsh left, Andrew and Chen continued their preparation. "They'll try to paint you as a drug dealer," she warned. "They'll question how you afford your lifestyle." "My cover identity has tax returns, employment history, everything needed to explain my income," Andrew replied. "Yes, but we have to be careful how much we reveal in open court," Chen cautioned. "The deputy director has authorized limited disclosure about your government work, but the details remain classified." Meanwhile, in another room down the hall, Daniels and Rodriguez sat with their union-appointed attorney, a tired-looking man named Graves, who had defended cops for 20 years. "This should be straightforward," Graves was saying. "The judge will see the evidence and—" "Something's wrong," Daniels interrupted. "The FBI doesn't get involved in routine drug cases. And why is Internal Affairs suddenly interested in our old arrests?" Rodriguez looked pale. "Maybe we should cut a deal before this gets worse." "No deals," Daniels snapped. "We stick to our story. The dash cam malfunctioned. We found drugs during a legal search. End of story." But Graves wasn't so confident. "There's something you're not telling me about this arrest, isn't there?" Before either could answer, an officer poked his head in the door. "They're ready for you in courtroom C." As they walked down the hallway, Daniels noticed unusual activity, men in suits with earpieces, looking too alert to be lawyers, positioned at key points throughout the building. Federal agents, he realized with growing unease. In yet another room, Deputy Director Wilson met with the district attorney, showing him documents that made the younger man's eyes widen. I had no idea," the DA stammered. "Few people do," Wilson replied. "That's rather the point. Now you understand why this case needs to be handled with particular care." "Of course," the DA agreed. "I'll personally oversee the dismissal of all charges against Mr. Taylor." Wilson shook his head. "That's not what we want." "Excuse me." "We want this to proceed," Wilson explained, "just not in the way that his officers expected. They broke the law and they need to face consequences. But we need to control how information is revealed." The DA looked confused. "What exactly are you proposing?" "A carefully orchestrated revelation," Wilson said. "One that protects national security while ensuring justice is served." At precisely 2 p.m., everyone gathered in courtroom C. Judge Hammond entered, her expression even more severe than usual. "Before we begin," she announced, "I've reviewed certain sensitive materials provided by the defense and have determined that we will proceed in a somewhat unusual manner. This court will be closed to the public for the first portion of today's proceedings." Officers Daniels and Rodriguez exchanged worried glances as court officers began clearing the room of spectators. "What's happening?" Rodriguez whispered to their attorney. Graves shook his head, looking as confused as they were. I have no idea. But whatever it is, it's not standard procedure. As the courtroom doors closed, leaving only the essential participants, Andrew caught the eye of Deputy Director Wilson, who had taken a seat in the back row. The older man gave a slight nod. The trap was set. Now it was time to spring it. The courtroom was eerily quiet after the spectators left. Only the judge, the attorneys, the officers, Andra, and a few carefully selected individuals remained. Judge Hammond adjusted her glasses and looked directly at the two police officers. "Officers Daniels and Rodriguez, do you understand why we're here today?" she asked, her voice stern and unyielding. "Yes, Your Honor," Daniels replied confidently. "We're here for the preliminary hearing regarding the drug charges against the defendant." The judge nodded slowly. "That's partially correct. We are indeed here about your arrest of Mr. Taylor. However, there are some additional matters we need to address first." She turned to Andrew's attorney. "Ms. Chen, you may call your first witness." Chen stood up, her posture perfect, her expression calm. "The defense calls Deputy Director Thomas Wilson." A murmur of confusion passed between the two officers. They watched as the gray-haired man they had noticed earlier walked to the witness stand. He moved with the quiet confidence of someone used to authority. After being sworn in, Wilson sat down and looked directly at the officers. There was something in his gaze that made both men shift uncomfortably in their seats. "Please state your name and position for the record," Chen requested. "Thomas Wilson, Deputy Director of Operations for the Central Intelligence Agency." The blood drained from Officer Daniel's face. Rodriguez gripped the edge of the table so hard his knuckles turned white. "And how do you know the defendant, Mr. Andrew Taylor?" Chen continued. Wilson straightened in his chair. "Andrew Taylor is one of our most valuable field operatives. He has served this country with distinction for 12 years, operating in some of the most dangerous regions of the world." The officer's attorney, Graves, jumped to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. This is clearly some kind of mistake or fabrication. What does the CIA have to do with a routine drug arrest?" "If you'll allow me to continue," Wilson said calmly, "I believe I can clarify matters for everyone present." The judge nodded. "Please proceed, Deputy Director." Wilson reached into his breast pocket and removed an envelope sealed with an official government stamp. He handed it to the bailiff, who brought it to the judge. "These documents, which have been cleared for limited disclosure in this proceeding, confirm Mr. Taylor's employment history, security clearance, and most recent mission. The mission was completed successfully just hours before his wrongful arrest." Judge Hammond reviewed the documents, her expression growing increasingly severe. She looked up at the officers, who were now visibly sweating. "Would you care to explain, officers, how you came to arrest an active CIA operative on fabricated charges?" she asked. We had no idea who he was," Daniel stammered. "We found drugs in his vehicle during a routine traffic stop." "That's a lie." Andrew spoke up for the first time. His voice was steady and clear. "They pulled me over for no reason. The alleged broken taillight was an excuse. They'd planted those drugs in my car while conducting an illegal search that I never consented to." Wilson nodded. "Your Honor, Mr. Taylor was returning from a mission that involved infiltrating a terrorist cell. The intelligence he gathered will help prevent planned attacks on American soil. Instead of receiving the thanks of a grateful nation, he was racially profiled, illegally searched, and framed by these officers." Rodriguez leaned over to whisper urgently to their attorney. Graves looked increasingly uncomfortable. "Furthermore," Wilson continued, "we've taken the liberty of examining the officers' dash cam footage." "They claimed it malfunctioned," Chen added. "Yes, they did," Wilson agreed. "However, our technical team was able to recover the data. With your permission, Your Honor, we'd like to play it for the court." The judge nodded, and a screen descended from the ceiling. A tech specialist set up a laptop, and suddenly everyone was watching crystal-clear footage of Andrew's traffic stop. The video showed his taillights were functioning perfectly. It captured the officer's aggressive approach, their comments about his race and his car, and most stunning of all, it clearly showed Rodriguez removing something from his pocket and placing it in Andrew's glove compartment while Daniels blocked Andrew's view. The courtroom fell completely silent as the video ended. Even the court reporter had stopped typing, too shocked by what she'd witnessed. Judge Hammond removed her glasses and stared directly at the officers. "In all my years on the bench," she said slowly, "I have never seen such a blatant abuse of power and violation of civil rights. Officer Daniels, Officer Rodriguez, you are both hereby remanded into custody pending charges of evidence tampering, false arrest, perjury, and civil rights violations." As court officers moved to take the stunned policeman into custody, Andrew caught Wilson's eye. The older man gave him a slight nod of respect. The truth had finally come out, but Andrew knew this was just the beginning. 6 months after the dramatic courtroom revelation, Andrew sat at an outdoor cafe, watching people walk by. His life had changed completely since that day. His deep cover identity was compromised, meaning he could no longer work in the field. But looking back, he realized maybe that wasn't such a bad thing. His phone buzzed with a news alert. He opened it to see Officers Daniels and Rodriguez being led into a federal courthouse in handcuffs. Today was sentencing day. The investigation that began with Andrew's case had snowballed into something much bigger. 28 cases of wrongful arrests and planted evidence had been uncovered. 17 people who had been wrongfully convicted based on the officers' testimony had already been released from prison. The police department was under federal oversight, and the chief of police had resigned in disgrace. "Mind if I join you?" a familiar voice asked. Andrew looked up to see Detective Walsh standing by his table, dressed in a suit instead of his usual rumpled detective's clothes. "Please." Andrew gestured to the empty chair. Walsh sat down with a tired sigh. "They got 15 years each, no chance of parole." Andrew nodded. Justice had been served, but he felt no joy in seeing men locked away. Only relief that they could no longer hurt innocent people. "How's the new job?" Andrew asked, noting Walsh's suit. Walsh smiled slightly. "Different. Leading the new Police Accountability Task Force isn't making me popular around the old precinct, but it feels right." After the scandal broke, Walsh had been promoted to head a newly formed oversight committee designed to identify and prevent police misconduct. His testimony against his fellow officers had cost him some friendships, but earned him respect from those who believed in real justice. "And you?" Walsh asked. "CIA find you a desk job?" Andrew smiled. "Something like that." In truth, Deputy Director Wilson had offered Andrew a unique opportunity. Instead of filing reports behind a desk, Andrew now headed a special training program for law enforcement agencies nationwide. The program focused on eliminating racial bias and building community trust. His first-hand experience as both a CIA operative and a victim of police misconduct gave him a perspective few others could offer. That conversation was interrupted by another arrival. Attorney Chen approached their table, carrying a thick folder. "Gentlemen," she greeted them, taking a seat. "The Justice Department just approved the settlement." She placed the folder on the table and opened it. Inside was a document outlining a comprehensive police reform plan that would be implemented nationwide, starting with the department that had employed Daniels and Rodriguez. "It's not perfect," Chen admitted, "but it's a start. Body cameras that can't be turned off, civilian review boards with real power, enhanced training requirements, and stronger penalties for officers who violate civil rights." Andrew ran his finger along the edge of the paper. "Will it make a difference?" "It already has," Walsh said firmly. "Applications from minority candidates are up 30% since the reforms were announced. People who never trusted the police enough to join are now seeing a path to change things from the inside." Chen nodded in agreement. "And the review of old cases has identified over 40 people who were wrongfully convicted based on similar patterns of evidence planting. The Innocence Project has taken up their cases." Andrew took a sip of his coffee, considering what all this meant. His ordeal had been painful, but the ripple effects were changing lives all across the country. "I got a letter yesterday," he said quietly, "from a man named Harold, who was released last week after serving 6 years on planted evidence. He said knowing that someone fought back and one gave him hope during his appeal." The three sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the city move around them. So much had changed, yet so much remained to be done. "Deputy Director Wilson called this morning," Andrew finally said. "They've identified 3 more departments with similar patterns of misconduct. They want us to expand the training program." Walsh nodded. "I'm in." "Me too," Chen agreed. This is just the beginning. Andrew looked up at the clear blue sky. For years, he had worked in the shadows, fighting threats from outside. Now he was doing something equally important, fighting for justice at home in the light of day. His CIA career hadn't ended that night when Daniels and Rodriguez pulled him over. It had simply transformed into something new, something that might ultimately protect even more American lives and liberty than all his covert missions combined. As they discussed their plans, Andrew realized that sometimes good could come from terrible situations. The system had failed him that night, but now he was helping to fix it, one department at a time. And that was a mission worth dedicating his life to.